Hey guys, welcome back to our Leagues lecture series. Today is lecture number 4, and I have the pleasure of welcoming my co-resident, Dr. Brooke Bredbeck, who is going to be teaching us today about the basics of basic translational science. I know that this whole experience is very health services research oriented. Like all of your mentors are HSR surgeons. And I mean, all of us, most of all the things that we do for the leadership team are around health services research. So I felt like it would be very advantageous to open the eyes of the world to the wonders of basic and translational science, which Dr. Bredbeck has been doing for the past year. She's originally from Colorado, like true and true. Like we'll tell you all the good places to go and all the nice places to see. She went to the University of Colorado for medical school and then came to join us at the University of Michigan year before I started, so she's 1 year ahead of me. She has been doing basic and translational research for the past year and is transitioning to an HSR setting. But she has intercepted a lot with both the conference, like the sharing of information and knowledge around basic and translational science, and then the actual what does it take for you to be a translational scientist in surgery. She's super awesome. I know that I keep saying that everybody's my favorite person, but that's because I only invited my favorite people to talk here to you, who are now part of my favorite people. She is an avid outdoors person and does all the cool things that clumsy people like me sometimes can do. She has the most adorable dog. Her name is Quito. And on her free time, she enjoys spending time in her garden and doing adventures with her dog and her husband. Brooke, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to see all of you and meet the ones who I hadn't met yet. So we will talk about basic and translational science. Let me do the awkward pause for screen share. Oh, host disabled, attendee screen share.
Host has enabled.
Yes. Okay, so I'm just going to assume that you guys can see my screen unless I hear otherwise. And does it look like presenter view to you right now?
It does.
Yep.
Ooh, I don't like presenter view. Mm-hmm. Didn't do that last time. Oh, I know why. Sorry, guys. Bear with me here for a sec. I just put a new monitor on my computer. So now I have 2 monitors because that's what everyone in chat does.
Oh yeah, that's what
So now it's trying to.
I didn't know that. Did I just just transform myself into a chopped human without knowing?
Yeah, you just need to work on it. It'll be fine. Maybe I can just unplug it.
While she gets more AV stuff done, I can tell you a little bit more about Brooke. Brooke has many talents. She's going to be a surgical oncologist.
One of them is not.
It's not.
I got it. We're good.
Is not technology.
But troubleshooting in a pinch, I'm okay at. So I think we're good. We can go. So I do want this to be a little bit interactive, which I know everyone probably says that, and then it's awkward and not interactive. So I'm going to just pick on people if I get bored talking because I talk too much already. So I'm going to talk to you guys about basic and translational science. First, I just want to recap. So I haven't been to any of these classes, but what have you guys learned so far in terms of finding mentors in research projects? Robert.
So we had a lesson from Dr. Ryan Howard, and he basically taught us how to start from scratch, I guess, on forming a project. I myself, I'm still forming my project, and I have my mentor meeting tomorrow, Friday, with Dr. Inglesby. So I can't say I have anything finalized just yet, but I guess that's what everyone's working on, is finalizing their project for the League's fellowship.
Cool. So you guys all have mentors, and then you're working on figuring out what that project is going to be, and then obviously the execution, which is very important. Sweet. Great. Well, that is very helpful. Gabrielle, when you think of basic or translational science, what comes to mind?
In all honesty, I'm not really 100% sure.
That's totally fine. Good. That's why we're having this talk.
Perfect.
See, what about Priscilla?
pipettes.
Yes, pipettes. Just like that this little guy. There you go. Yeah, what else? Anything else?
I guess just like on animal models, or do all the science that then is the step before actually gets brought to the patient level. So it's like, I don't know, testing out your theories and doing all that like preliminary work before actually working with the patient directly and testing out.
That's perfect. Great. I would say, like, before I started, I didn't really know what any of it meant, but I imagined like someone in a white coat and like a really sterile environment, definitely pipetting something. There might have been like some mice running around involved. So that's kind of what I thought about when I thought about basic science too. Basic and translational science, in essence, are the foundation of biomedical therapy. So we have all these different ways of tackling health problems, and those can be things like implementation science, clinical research, preclinical research, public health research. And if you're investigating the actual mechanisms of disease, the biomedical therapies rather than like the public health therapies, that's going to lead into this like basic and translational realm of science. Basic research is the people who are like playing in the sandbox, the metaphorical sandbox. They do not care at all how relevant their science is. They just want to get in that lab and just figure out what enzyme X does, whether it's helpful for humankind or not. They just are super interested in figuring out why it works. So those are the basic science researchers. The translational researchers are the ones who care about bringing the bench research to the bedside. So in medicine, I would say, while we use the word basic science kind of interchangeably with translational, most of the time, if you're a physician who's doing research and you're doing something on the bench, you're going to end up doing translational research. Because as a doctor, it's your job to say, this is a problem. And I think that this basic science thing, if we investigate it more, can eventually become a therapy. And that's the translational bench to bedside aspect that's really important. So I was thinking about this talk, and I'm thinking that most of you guys are probably still at the like very like pre-contemplative, just playing around with what you're interested in stage of figuring out how you want to do research. And one of the things that when I be X, Y, or Z, do I have like a compatible nature with whatever this profession is? So I thought about what types of traits make someone a successful scientist. And I would say that one of the fundamental things is really being curious about the fundamental physiology or pathophysiology of things. So if you're one of those people who's like, but how does it work? And you keep wanting to get to the why over and over again, then you're going to be a great translational or basic scientist. You also have to be really detail oriented, not that this is unique in any way to basic or translational science. You basically have to be detail oriented in a lot of avenues of life to be successful, but especially in basic science, because you have to be very exacting in the way that you follow the protocol and in the way that you execute and document your protocol. Because if you mess up, but you document it well, then that's a learning experience. But if you mess up and you don't document it, then you kind of are just left out for that day, and it was kind of just like a waste of your time. You also have to be really patient. So I don't think that I've ever been involved with any type of research where failure happens so often and it's just completely expected and okay. And underlying that patience, there's also this like optimism that, kind of like what I said before, if you make a mistake and you document it, then that's something that you learned, and you just will incorporate that into the next time you do the experiment. Normally it's like, don't do it that way again. But sometimes it leads you to an aha moment where you realize something you hadn't realized before, and you can actually learn from your failures. So if you are optimistic and patient, you can be a good basic and translational scientist. You also have to be creative, which again is not unique to translational and basic science, but you have to be able to bring together concepts that maybe people haven't already brought together before. Dr. Dimmock, he is our chair and he's one of our attendings. He has some great quote, and now I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's basically like, great research lies at the like at the border between two fields. So if you're talking to someone who's like, I'm a data scientist, and you're talking to someone who's like a social scientist, and you're really interested in healthcare delivery for patients with end-stage renal disease, finding a way to like marry those two things can actually be very novel. And it's the same thing in basic and translational science. If you are able to pair like genome software with looking at like genetics of some sort of like infection or cancer or something like that, often you can create a lot of really novel, interesting ideas. Within basic science, you also have to be a self-starter and a team player, which is kind of hard to do when you're first starting off, because a lot of the time your self-starting is not so much like, oh, I'm going to accomplish this, but hey, I don't know what I'm doing. And you have to be really comfortable doing that. I think you have to be comfortable doing that in surgery in general. So honestly, just like work on that in surgery. And if it's something that you're comfortable doing, then that's great. I think a lot of people, when they think of basic science, they think of the loner and the lab. And I definitely was one of those people who thought of it that way, but it's really a team sport. Your lab is going to be kind of like your family while you're there, and they are somebody that you're going to rely on, someone that you're going to bounce ideas off of, and even collaboration between labs. Now with the funding the way that it is, most of the labs that are getting the most funding are ones who are collaborating with other labs and like not just playing well as a team within their lab, but actually between labs. You also have to be okay with slow burning success, which kind of goes into the patient's aspect. And this has surprised a lot of people, you have to be a good writer. There's like no research that you can do and not be a good writer. So for everyone who like didn't pay as much attention during the writing classes, it's fine, you still have time. But if you were someone who liked writing and you thought that you were throwing away a skill set just because you're going into medicine, totally not true. You will absolutely use it, and it will be really, really valuable for you. The type of person who shouldn't be a basic or translational scientist also fits some of the stereotypical description of a surgeon, which is someone who needs absolutely immediate results right now. There's a lot of waiting in basic science. So if that's someone who you would describe yourself as, it might not be the best fit for you. But otherwise, I really don't think there's anything that's that would like exclude you from doing basic or translational science. Any questions about that or comments? Cool. Awesome.
I would guess that you would also have to be like always have the ability to maybe have the curiosity, but not get derailed from your main focus, because curiosity can drive your mind crazy and you can very easily start going off topic. So I guess like be very centered probably in like what is be able to have that distinction between, okay, I can do this later, but I have to focus on this now, like in research wise.
Totally. I think being able to like prioritize what's important is really helpful. And again, I think that's where being a physician scientist becomes really, really valuable, because you have all these basic scientists that are getting out in the sandbox playing around. Who knows what they're doing? It's really confusing for everyone. And you can say like, look, you have 20 great ideas, but 2 of them are actually really great, and we should work on those, and you can kind of keep them more focused. Jessica, when you think of a stereotypical basic scientist, what do you think of?
A stereotypical basic scientist, like you mean like a person that?
Yeah, like extroverted, introverted, man, woman, old, young.
Well, I'm biased. So I was in a lab that we did both research of basic to preclinical to translationals. But I think when you originally hear like the stereotypical that you've heard people talk about, you think of a man doing, like you said, research in the corner, pipetting, but that's not what I've encountered.
Yeah, which is great. And that's exactly what I hope everyone will encounter if they do run into the basic science world. It's really changed a lot in the past few years. It was already changing a while ago, but I think it's changed even more. And I think there's kind of this conception that you have to be like an introvert to be a basic scientist, because you have to be okay being alone. But again, this is much more of a team sport than it used to be, which I think is really good for everyone. And especially like that image stereotype of it being like an old white dude, like on his own in a lab, like that's really not the case anymore. So if you feel like you can't be a basic scientist because you care about advocacy and policy and being a leader, that's not true. You can absolutely be all of those things. If you're an extrovert, you can absolutely be a basic scientist. And if you have zero experience because you just never thought about it or you didn't know what it was before you start medical school, you can absolutely still try basic science and become a successful basic scientist. On the bottom left is Dr. Rob Wynn, who is a pulmonary critical care doctor who was at the University of Colorado when I was there as a medical student. And I think he was the reason that 50% of my class ended up going to Colorado, because this man is just a legend. He's wonderful. He's a basic scientist, and he's also like a huge advocate, not just for certain patient populations that he's really passionate about, but also for the medical students. And I'll never forget him, even though he left like 2 years after I started at the University of Colorado. He's always made a huge impression on me. So now when I think about a basic scientist, I think about him. Also, I included the Twitter of like one of these people that I follow who I just think is wonderful. And she's an astrophysicist, which is super badass. And she has 100,000 followers on Twitter. So you can absolutely be someone who's doing like kind of, niche research and still have a fan base of people or like a platform for advocacy.
I just wanted to say really fast that Seraphina is actually friends with one of my friends, and she's really cool. So I was like so surprised that she's on there.
Yeah, she's great. I don't remember when I found out about her, but I was like, she's awesome. I think she has a YouTube channel too, where she like gets drunk and talks about astrophysics, which is really fun to watch. So you guys should consider watching that as well.
Yeah, no, she's great.
Awesome. Awesome. Any questions or comments about that? Cool. Gracia, what have you learned so far about the road to becoming an independent researcher? So like getting funding, being part of like a research group. Did Ryan talk about anything like that?
He did not. So this is a great question. So I don't know very much about this stuff, honestly. I feel like I've just from like being in the opioids research lab, I've heard some terms kind of get thrown around, like a K grant and like an R01, which I know that the NIH has, I guess, like different levels of grants that you can apply for, which I think probably come with different tiers of funding and also like different levels of experience. So I know that some types of grants are for like junior faculty or for people who are starting out their lab versus people who might have like a larger project going on. And apart from that, I just know that like the May-June timeframe is stressful because there are like grant renewals and stuff, but that's really all I know.
You know way more than I did as a medical student. I remember meeting with a researcher who was doing, I don't remember, it had to do with lungs, and I was like seeing if I wanted to work in his lab, and he's like, I just got my R01, and I was like, I have no idea what that means, and I'm not going to look it up because it's way too over my head. So yeah, the funding landscape is like really confusing, and I still don't understand most of it because I'm just a simple country resident and I don't need to worry about that quite as much yet. But I think it's important to know, depending on where you end up going to residency, that funding is going to be important for you in residency, and there are different ways to get funding. And with funding often comes the opportunity for the research, because a lot of times the funding is tied to the research project. So some ways would be like internal, which would include like just working unfunded in a lab if a lab has money to spend on you, and that would be unusual but possible. A lot of attendings when they start off have like startup funds, but most of the time in basic science, they're going to be using those startup funds to like buy microscopes or something fancy, and they don't have as much money for help around the lab. So then you can look into options like an institutional grant. The NIH has funding that they give as salary support, and that includes T32s, F32s, if you're faculty, K awards, and R awards. And those all give like a set amount of money. It's the same amount of money for every like subtype of grant that's like specifically salary support for whoever that person is. So a T32 is when the NIH says, hey, Michigan, I really like what you're doing there with surgical oncology, so I'm going to give you X amount of money to hire on 2 T32 fellows, and you can use this money to support their salary while they're T32 fellows. So that still requires doing a lot of work, which is like putting together this thing called a batch. You have to put like all of your educational information and then a paragraph about like who you are, and not just like, hi, my name is Brooke, but like, I'm a future surgical oncologist, and these are all of the things that I've done so far that show that I'm interested in surgical, oncology research, which for me, I'm a resident, so I had like one thing that I talked about, and that was supposed to be my narrative. So it's just interesting, all the different like little hoops that they make you jump through, just to get like an institutional grant sometimes. If you want to apply for a society grant, it's a very similar thing, but you're applying through the like Association of Academic Surgery or the American College of Surgeons or the University Surgeons. So all of the surgical societies have grants that they can give to fellows. And by fellows, I mean a research fellow. So you would be a resident. They would be giving you a grant for a fellowship to do research.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Sorry. Is this all for residents and for attendings? And like, as a resident, do you have the opportunity to apply to these attending grants, or is it divided by like attending grants, resident grants, and then other grants? How does that work?
Yeah, great question. A T32 is an institutional grant that I believe can only be given to like a resident or a fellow. And F32 is a grant that I think a resident or fellow can get, but that, instead of being from the institution, is to the individual. So it looks better on your CV because you're like, I got the F32. And then the K and the R awards, those are specific to faculty. So it is level dependent, but it's supposed to be like a flow chart. So like if you're cool enough to get an F32, which I was not cool enough to get an F32, because it was just way too much work, and I was like, I can't do this. If you get the F32, the idea is that if you get a lot of good data from that, that can build to your R. And if your R is really successful, that can build, you get your K. And if your K is really successful, that will build to your R. So they call it like the K to R transition. And if someone's really successful, they will often be able to do that. And there are studies that have been done that show people who get an F32. So if you're interested, you can do this in HSR, you can do this in like outcomes, you can do this in basic science. If you're interested in F32, you can apply for one. And they've done studies and found that people who get F32s in surgery are much more likely to get K awards and much more likely to get R awards. So it's definitely an indicator of future success.
Question on that, like how competitive are these grants, and like how many people are applying? What's the success rate like?
Yeah, a lot of people are applying. They're super competitive. The way that I have come to look at it is I have whatever percent of getting the grant, even if I have an absolutely amazing grant, and I want to get rejected at least a few times because it means that I'm trying enough. So like the way that Dimick talks about it is like, if the New England Journal, if their rejection rate is 95%, then if your acceptance rate for them is like 50%, that means that you're not sending enough manuscripts to them. You want to have the same rejection rate that they have on average, or else you're like underselling yourself. So it's good when you're looking at institutions to make sure that they have safety nets. So for me, the safety net was like a T32. I knew that there were 2 surgical oncology T32s. No one else in my class is interested in surgical oncology. That was my safety net. I applied for Association of Academic Surgery grant, and I didn't get it. it's fine, it happens. And so I had the T32 to fall back on, and I knew that Michigan was going to give that to me either way. If I had happened to get the AAS grant, that would have been awesome, but it's fine. It worked out fine.
And then one more follow-up question. Do you have to be like in a lab with an attending to apply to these things, or could you just be like, I'm Brooke, I'm a superstar, I want to just start my own lab, can I like apply by myself?
Great question. So one of the factors that they use to score your grant application is your mentorship and the institution, the support that you're going to get at the institution. So it absolutely is critical that you have mentorship. And it's because, like, if you guys have had good mentors in the past, it's so much easier to be successful if you have a mentor. And it's not just about resources, it's about someone who just knows what the heck they're doing, who can help you out and who can focus your energy. So they know that that's important, and therefore it's actually part of the equation. You could be the most brilliant person ever, but if you don't have support, it's not going to get approved or funded. Really good question.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the F-32, we've had, I know Ben Biesterveld got it his year, which is the PGY 6 year. I think someone got it, Craig got it in my year, and I think someone got it the year below him. So like out of the 7 of us, like on average, one person gets an F-32 about every single year. The rest of us normally get tacked onto a T-32, or we try for a society grant. And I would say like one person every other year gets a society grant at Michigan. So for the most part, we're relying on our institutional grants. So if you're really interested in doing research, make sure that you apply to a place that will be able to guarantee you funding in some way, even if you don't get one of these big grants. Very important. Another thing you can do is look outside of your program. So as someone who's interested in surgical oncology, I'm very aware of the NCI program, which is one where you apply and you actually go to the National Cancer Institute and do research there. And that's 2 years of basic science research in cancer. And they have a lot of focus on tumor immunology, which I think is just the best. So I think that's a good option if you end up at a place that, for example, doesn't have guaranteed funding. Another thing you can do is you can use an outside institution's T32. So Michigan has, like I said, we have 2 surgical oncology T32s every single year, but not everyone wants to go into surg onc. So we have people that come from other institutions and they're on our University of Michigan T32, but they're doing cancer research here, even though they're residents at other places. So that definitely happens too. And there are places where that's posted. And one of them is the Association of Program Directors in Surgery, so the APDS website, and they post that annually. Questions?
I think Gracia posted a question, but I'm gonna ask it because I had the same one. So she asked, where do we find that information about like the surgery residency programs guaranteeing funding and time of research? That was her question.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I think it'll change a little bit with this current application cycle. Before, it was really hard to find that information online because programs relied on their like reputation or word of mouth, or they wanted to hide that information because they didn't have guaranteed funding. But I think now that a lot of these interviews are going virtual and the online platform is going to be much more important for residents, I'm hoping that the places will be doing a better job of advertising when they have guaranteed funding. If you can't find it from the website, ask the residents. And most of the residents like have some sort of a page on their university website, or email is available. If not, you can always email the program director, and that's fine. I mean, I know it's awkward, or it seems awkward, but it's part of, we can't give like more money because of all this like weirdness around residency. Like, we can't draw you in by giving you more money or better perks or benefits or anything in residency. So the only things that you really have to go on are things like this. Like, do you have dedicated research time? Do you have dedicated funding? So I think it's a really legitimate question to ask.
Great. Thank you for that, Brooke.
Of course. What else?
I had a quick question. Is it out of the norm to apply to these grants if you're not in your dedicated research year during residency, like applying during like your second year, third year?
Do you mean applying during your second or third year with the intention of
like I
using that
know
funding for dedicated research time, or?
I was just saying, because I know Michigan, and correct me if I'm wrong, you guys have like 2 years of just dedicated research. But I'm saying, like, can you apply, or do people apply like outside of those 2 years, like during their actual hospital rotations?
I think that the expectation is you're going to use that funding to do full-time research for the most part. Yeah. There are definitely ways to do research during clinical time. And I think that that's a really valuable thing, especially for programs unlike Michigan that can't afford to just send all their residents into dedicated research years. I think everyone still needs to know how to do, rigorous research, or at least how to interpret rigorous research. But I think that the funding aspect is more for people that are gonna that want to do career science for at least a couple years. What else? Okay, I think that was it. Yeah.
Or the only thing I was going to say too, I don't know the details of it, but I think what's also applicable for our group here is they also have diversity supplement. So that's funding from the NIH that can provide supplements that if you're working with a mentor that already has a grant, like an R01 or something, you're able to apply and get funding. And the one thing I don't know, because I got this like during my PhD, I don't know the time commitment. If people, like if you're a medical student, if you can do it while you're in medical school, or you need to like take a year and have like designated like research time to it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for bringing that up. And then kind of separately, the other societies to think about would be like SBAS and AWS and things like that. So societies that are more focused on underrepresented medicine groups, they also have they also have they also have society grants and stuff that are available too. So those are all really good points. Great. Okay, we'll go to the next one. So we talked about how you kind of have to have a plan for who you're going to work with and what kind of research you want to do before you jump into this, research time. And if you want to get funding, you have to like have this huge write-up prepared and ready. So that would lead me to ask, like, how do I know who I want to do research with? Because I'm going to be investing a bunch of time, blood, sweat, and tears, probably at least a little bit into this. Like, how do I figure out who's going to be a good fit for me? So I think one thing to go into it with is knowing what you are capable of and what you still need to learn is really important. And that's not to say, again, that if you're starting out cold and you're like, I don't know how to do any of this, that's still fine. That's totally fine. But you just need to know that so that when you go to your mentor and you tell them, I haven't really learned much about aseptic technique. I haven't really learned much about pipetting, not that it's that hard, or like, I don't know how to do just. If you set that precedent, then that mentor knows how much time they're going to need to spend with you or how much time other people are going to need to spend to train you. The last thing you want is to make it sound like you know a lot more than you do, and then the mentor doesn't have time to teach you, and then you're kind of limited. So what you want is if you are starting out a lot colder than maybe the average person is, making sure that you have a mentor who's like, I see that, I'm on board. I'm going to set you up with this person, this person, and this person. They're going to teach you these 3 techniques, and then we're going to outsource all the microscopy stuff to this person. So you just want to be realistic about what you can and can't do so far. In addition, finding the right mentor on top of like all that other stuff is really, really crucial. And it's probably a lot more important than the science that they're doing. So while I understand that there might be one thing super, super excited, like for me, it was tumor immunology. Sometimes there's someone who's doing like alveoli research or something who actually is going to end up being a much better mentor for you. And most of the research that you do as a medical student is probably going to be different than what you end up doing as a medical student and a resident. It's probably going to be different than what you end up doing in your career. In a fellowship, if you take an extra year for research, that could perhaps translate better to your career. But I wouldn't worry that like if you find an absolutely wonderful mentor in colorectal surgery, but you don't want to be a colorectal surgeon, that's okay. I think it's better to have a good relationship with that person and have them push you and make you the best person. I think that's more important than them being specifically in your area of interest. Any questions about any of that so far, or comments? Okay, awesome. If you're talking to a mentor who you think is going to be a good fit, the other thing that's important is to get an idea of what additional support is going to be there, because it's not just going to be you and your mentor. It's going to be you, your mentor, and everyone else who's in the lab. And especially if your mentor is a surgeon, they might not be around the lab very often. So you might end up spending like 90% of your time with other people who are not your mentor. So it's important to see what kind of financial assistance do we have? Are we always scrambling to get funds to do the next experiment, or are we like doing okay? Who are we gonna have who helps out with technical assistance? So like for my lab, for example, we had microscopy, we had gels, we had flow cytometry, and we had histotripsy. So it's like all these different things. But while that sounds really tough, like I had a flow cytometry core that I could go to. I had a microscopy guy that I could go to. So then the things that I needed to learn went from like way overwhelming to like 2 things that I had to learn. And that made it a lot easier and allowed me to like work more on the project unless I'm learning every single. Questions, comments?
Just probably just like commenting on that, like the first point, I feel like that's very essential in the sense that you like letting your mentor know like what are your capabilities or how much time if they are willing to put in the time to help you. Because I did have now actually learning what is basic in translation, I actually did have some exposure to this, but it was very short because of that, because I wasn't prepared, and actually the mentor didn't have the time to train me. So I ended up not doing much, and it was time lost. But yeah, I guess that just commenting that it's actually essential, because I literally would stay in the lab, sitting in my corner, not knowing what to do, because no. So
Yeah.
I just wanted to comment on that.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you. I remember in undergrad, I met with a guy who ended up being my PI, and he was like, "Do you know how to do PCR?" And I was like, "I don't even know what PCR stands for, so I definitely don't know how to do it." So yeah, It's just good to like start and be like, "This is where I'm at. This is where you are, and we just need to figure out how to get me there, and it'll be fine." Awesome. Other questions. So you met with your mentor. You think that you jive pretty well. It seems like you have a good amount of support that's going to be available, so you don't have to learn like every single technique that they're doing in the lab, and it feels like it's going to be manageable. So what other questions do you want to ask when you're like when you're choosing a lab and you're making that decision? Things that I think are important are asking about what your level of supervision and autonomy are. So those are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. If you're being supervised too much, sometimes that can mean overbearing and you're losing your autonomy and you aren't able to guide your own projects. If you are not being supervised sufficiently, and that might mean, for example, they like taught you a new technique and they saw you do it once and they're like, "Okay, bye, you got this." And you're like, "Wait, I have questions. I need you. I tried to text you and you won't answer me." So you want to make sure that you have a good balance where people are giving you the teaching that you need. But if you have ideas, that you're going to be supported in doing an autonomous project if they think that you have the skills to do that. Obviously, knowing what you're studying is really helpful, but along that line, are we doing like one main project as a lab, or are we doing multiple projects? Sometimes like one lab will spread itself thin and be doing like many projects, and maybe they shouldn't be doing that. And if it sounds like there's one lab, like the 5 members are all doing 5 different things, it might be a lot harder for you to get help if you need it, because people might not be as available to help you. So making sure that kind of there's a little bit of a team aspect there where everyone kind of knows what everyone else is doing. Asking how they expect to teach you and how you're going to learn lab techniques is really important. So kind of like what we were talking about, so I won't go too much into depth on that. The other thing you want to do, especially in surgery, so if you, for example, do the Michigan route where you go to a residency, you put in some time clinical, and then you do dedicated 2 years of research time. You need to put out some sort of product. It's going to be papers and it's going to be first authors, and you need to figure out like how many you need for whatever you're doing. But you need to make sure that you also have some second author papers, some middle author papers, and things like that. In PhD land, they do their like prelims and stuff. Jessica can probably talk more about that. But it takes forever for them most of the time to get out their first paper. And if you are going into a lab with someone who's not a surgeon, they're on a totally different timeline than you are. You really need to speed up that timeline. So you need to make sure that you're in a lab that understands what your needs are, what your timeline is, and that they have you on board, not just to do your own projects where you're going to be first authored, but that all the other papers that are getting published in that lab that you're going to be middle authored in, and that's going to show on your CV, because that's really, really important, is being able to leave with a product showing that you were doing something for that time. And then the last thing,
what's a ballpark number of papers like you should try to aim for during the 2 years, like both first, second author, like middle author?
Yeah, so basic science, while we go a lot faster in basic science than the PhD people are used to, we go much slower than the HSR people. So I would say at least having one first author paper and then maybe 2 to 3 middle author papers would definitely be sufficient coming out of the basic science lab, as long as that first author paper is like sufficient enough impact. So if you're publishing in like a journal whose impact factor is like 1, and that's your only first author paper, and you want to apply into like peds or surgical oncology, something competitive, then they might balk a little bit at that. But if you have like one high impact paper that you're first author on and middle authored on other ones, that'll be enough. And people definitely do more, but I wouldn't feel bad about that if I left the lab with one really good first author paper.
And for like, okay, so for example, residency, we're able to, in terms of publishing, like we're able to put papers, but it's also count like presentations and poster presentations as part of our like credit in like doing research. In this dedicated, are they looking more for like only papers, or are also are presentations also considered?
Yeah, they're both considered, and they actually, I can show you like example CV after we're done with this talk, but you'll put them in like slightly different portions of your CV. I would say as a medical student, getting a presentation, like a national presentation, is huge, and we love that. And if you're first author paper on a paper, that's great. But like if you have a national presentation, it means that you did some sort of meaningful research and were able to speak eloquently about it at least one instance, which is awesome. In residency, you're definitely going to be expected to present that research. I would say if you're doing basic science, presentation might be a little bit more important than in HSR land, because you're going to have fewer papers. So what you can do, for example, is your paper, if you're publishing basic science, will be like 6 experiments put into one paper, because you have to like make a narrative. So it's like, we found this, and then we asked what next, and then we did another experiment. So what you can do is you can break up those 8 different experiments that you put into one paper into 8 different presentations at a national conference or a local conference. So if you can prove that you were doing a novel experiment every few months and were able to present, you know, the same thing, the same paper, but different aspects of the paper like 5 different times, I think that speaks volumes, especially if you're doing it at a national level. Yeah. Another thing that I didn't actually mention here, but I will now mention, is that you can totally do basic science and clinical research or like HSR research at the same time. If you do basic science, it'll probably take up between like 30 and 50 hours of your week, but some weeks like all of your cells die and then you have nothing to do. So it's nice to have a couple projects on the side. Like for me, I went and talked to Dr. Dossett like September of last year, and I said, I'm doing basic science in melanoma. I right now it's like really quiet because we didn't have any of this virus to infect the mice with. And I was like, can I do something with you that I can kind of like do throughout the year? And she got me onto this project that I've now been doing for the past year. And I got to like own that. I got to like submit the IRB and do all the data collection. I interview all the patients because it's like a qualitative project. And because I do that kind of on my own time, I like schedule when I'm going to talk to the study subjects, and it's like in the evenings. I could schedule that really easily with my around my basic science stuff. So it's not like you can't do both. And that would have gotten me, like, it will get me probably a first author paper. So that's like a non-basic science first author paper, even though I was doing basic science. And that was the same thing with her, like I was talking about before. I went to her and I said, I'm doing basic science. I'm not a fancy schmancy HSR researcher. I don't know much about this, but I'm interested in learning more about it. I can dedicate 5 to 10 hours a week to a project with you. Do you have any projects that you can think of that would be amenable to that? And she's like, yeah. And then she thought of one and it was awesome. Cool. And then the last thing, I think it's really important to meet the other lab members. So if you are really excited about a lab, but you haven't met any of the lab members, just a mentor, I would definitely try to set either a meeting or swing by the lab to say hi to people to get an idea of who's in the lab and how easy they are to work with. Sometimes it's really hard to figure out how easy people are to work with until you start working with them. But if you have like a mole in the lab group, you can be like, hey, what's it like working with John? And they can kind of tell you like what those people are like. So use those connections. That's all I have. So we can do Q&A if you guys have questions, comments, or anything. And it doesn't have to be basic science related. You can ask me anything.
I do have a question. I am interested in surgical oncology, and I'm curious, I guess, what the distribution is like of people going into surgical oncology doing basic translational science versus the health services research.
I feel like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I feel like the reason you're asking that question is because you want to see, like, should I do basic science or something else? And in answer to that question, you should do whatever you want, because whatever you're most passionate about, you're going to put way more energy into and you're going to be more productive at. And then when you're interviewing, you're going to be able to speak so much better about it and with so much more passion. And that's contagious. People love passion. So do whatever you want to do. If you want to do basic science, there are plenty of opportunities for that. If you don't, there are so many leading surgical oncologists who do HSR outcomes research, and not even that, but like qualitative research and things like that are even like softer. So I think that you can be absolutely successful in anything.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions over there? That was awesome, Brooke. Thank you so much.
Of course.
I don't know if anybody from my class got it. I know that a couple of people apply. So they have to read through GLANT. It is like quite the package. At some point, like, you know, they give us like an orientation of like, okay, this is where the money's at. And I like looked at it and I was like, so I want to have the strength of character to do this. But however, it is a long application. At some point, I will fill a long application for something.
Yeah, it's true. It's like you can't really escape it, but you can delay it longer.
One thing that I did want to mention is that a lot of these societies, even though like a year level, like you're like thinking, you always have to be thinking 5 years up the road, hopefully 10, so that then like you can start like plotting for what you're going to be doing. But as medical students, I think one of the things that is hard to do is to like, especially when you're like in the middle of medical schools, like trying to like pay for just like living, and then you'll have the opportunity of going to a conference here in Michigan. There is, I found out there's like conference support, which is like super fancy. Like I went to a regular medical school. There was no money anywhere for any like going to conferences or anything. However, a lot of the society, I will say probably like great majority of at least surgical societies, and then some of the medicine ones too, have medical school like scholarships or like grants that you can apply to, which are usually not necessarily for you to conduct your research, but rather for you to be able to afford to go present your research. So like if your abstract is accepted to one of, like, for example, Association of Academic Surgery has a really good one, which is a travel scholarship, which will like get you to the conference. whenever the world is not longer imploding and it's like an actual thing. And then I know I don't know when that's gonna happen. And they, for example, for some conferences that have like didactics or courses associated with them, which the Association for Academic Surgery does, sometimes it includes like free registration and your lodging and your meals and stuff when you are chosen to present. So if you ever find yourself getting to that point, like of like, oh, I want to go present something, but like, you know, my mentor like can't afford it, or like you get something done and you're like, you know, you already like ran out you already like shook down your mentor for as much money as you could. There's always society grants that you can apply to. And then the other thing that I think students forget, and just Brooke's discussion of the money is like super important because you can't move in this world without funding, is that the American College of Surgeons that has a medical school student programming at their national conference every year, which is actually really good. It's like 2 days of like a lot of good stuff. That's free for medical students. So if you ever find yourself interested in like participating on that, and you know, it'll probably be virtual this year. It will be virtual this year. Whenever it happens in person, that's something that you can register and have access to for free. So there's a lot of free stuff out there for medical students and opportunities to be able to get some money to go present your research. You're
yeah. I think like, at least for me, I grew up like feeling like you follow these rules and then these things happen, and if people don't present you with an option, then it's not available. But if I've learned anything in my time, it's like the people who ask for stuff are the ones who get stuff. So if there's not an option for funding at your med school, just ask and see what happens, and maybe funding will magically appear. That happens a lot at Michigan, but it also happens at other places too. And I think, again, like going along the lines of passion being contagious, if you're really excited about something, people want to foster that because they see like that light in your eyes and they don't want that to go away. So they will throw money at that.
The bottom line of it. Brooke, thank you very much for coming and talking to us.